When it comes to the existence of God, many unbelievers like to ask, well, I need, show me some evidence of God. Show me proof of his existence. I need to see this before I believe. Well, I always like to say, do you really want answers to these questions? Do you really want evidence? Do you really want proof of God's existence? The reason I say that is because of things I see in scripture that I think unbelievers resemble in their objections to God and his existence today. And the first one is I want to talk about Satan. In Job chapter 1, verse 6, it reads, "One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them." So here we see that devil came to present himself before God. And in this example, it clearly shows that Satan was in the physical presence of God. He knew God personally in that sense. And this must have been after Satan had already rebelled and God was still allowing him and these other angels to come before him in some manner, however that looked. So, like I said, Satan obviously had some kind of relationship with him. I don't mean like a saving relationship like Christians do, but he knew God. He was in his presence. And then, so in this instance, he had proof of God. He knew him, and God knew him because God would talk to him about Job in the subsequent verses. Yet, Satan still rejected God. He still rejected him after knowing him and having this kind of relationship with him. He still rejected God. The second one is Adam himself, the first creation, the first man, Adam. In Genesis 2, verses 19 and 20. So Genesis 2, 19 and 20, it says, "Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all cattle, to all the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him." So again, what do we see here? This is in the perfect world, in the Garden of Eden, where God and Adam shared a moment together as father and son, where God got with Adam to see what Adam was to name the animals. He wanted to learn what Adam was going to call the animals that God had created. And so basically, Adam had a relationship with God too, similar to what we talked about with in Job with God and Satan. We see here God had a relationship with Adam. Adam knew God's existence, was sat down and named the animals in the presence of God like a father and son, sharing a loving moment. So he had proof of God. He knew of God's existence. This is Adam I'm talking about. And yet, what do we know? Adam rejected God. Later on, we found out that, through Eve, Eve was deceived by Satan and they ate the forbidden fruit and they rebelled. They rejected God and were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The third example is the Jews in the wilderness. So this was after the Exodus when the Jews were rescued from slavery in Egypt. We read in Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 and 19. "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, 'You speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die.'" What do we see here? We have the Jews who had experienced God rescuing them from slavery in Egypt. And in the midst of that rescuing, what did they experience? They experienced the 10 plagues of Egypt, where God judged the gods of Egypt through these plagues. And while these plagues were ravaging the Pharaoh and his nation and the Egyptian people, the Jews were spared. So they saw this incredible stuff, the locusts, the frogs, the flies, the Nile turning to blood, all these things they saw, the death of the firstborn and everything of that nature, and that they were spared from it. They saw all this going on. And then on their journey out of Egypt, what did they experience when they were with God? God guided them by a pillar of smoke during the day and a pillar of fire at night. God fed them manna, so they had something to eat out in the desert. And their clothes didn't wear out. All the time they were in the desert, their clothes never wore out. They witnessed the parting of the Red Sea during this. And they saw how they crossed on dry land across the Red Sea. And then they witnessed as God returned the waters to the Red Sea and killed Pharaoh's army in the midst of that. They saw these incredible miracles. And here in these verses in Exodus, it talks about they witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. They saw all this. And what do? They basically told God to shut up. They're like, we don't want to hear from you. We want to hear from Moses. Don't talk to us. We're afraid of you. If we hear from you, we're going to die. They didn't want to hear from God. They rejected God, a God who they clearly had evidence of through all these things that they witnessed in their rescuing from Egypt and the life they were living out in the wilderness as they traveled to the promised land. But what did? They rejected God, even though they knew he existed. They saw the miraculous signs and everything, and they rejected him. And so, like I said, they told God to shut up because they wanted to hear from Moses instead of him, because they were scared. And then the fourth example is the obvious one, Jesus Christ. In Mark 15, verses 11 through 15, it reads, "But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, 'What then do you want me to do with him who you call the King of the Jews?' So they cried out, 'Crucify him.' Then Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they cried out all the more, 'Crucify him.' So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified." So what do we see here? Jesus came to live among the people, the Jewish people, for 30 years or more, and he lived a sinless life. He performed countless miracles, including healing leprosy, what the Jews believed was only something the Messiah could do. He claimed to be God. Yet when they had the opportunity to free Jesus, who again is God in the flesh, who they had falsely accused in order to get him killed, they rejected God again by not releasing Jesus, and it took Barabbas, and then Jesus was crucified. They not only rejected God, they killed him. God in the flesh, they killed him. And that's what they did with Jesus Christ. And we could read the Gospels and see what Jesus suffered because of their rejection of him. So these are people and events in history, in biblical history, where God was personally involved in the lives of the people, and they all rejected him. Then this doesn't even touch on the other evidences that we see of God, where we have the creation of the heavens and the earth, our natural inclination to recognize good and evil, our conscience that we have, evidence from science and history that support the people, places, and events accorded in the Bible. And of course, the Bible itself, a book that was written over 66 books written by 40 authors over 1,500 years and across 3 different continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. We have all of this. But we see the what I just said, how the people rejected God in who was in their face, in their presence, who they had a relationship with. They walked with him, saw his miraculous signs, all these things that he did for them, and they rejected him. And then he's given the world the evidences of the heavens and the earth, the air we breathe, the ground we live on, the things we create with are things that he allows us to create with. He's given us a conscience, in order to make decisions about right and wrong and morality and all this type of stuff. And yet what do? We reject him for it. So with all that in mind, we come to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. There, Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." It says here, they suppress the truth. This is a deliberate act of denying or hiding the reality of God's existence, his attributes, and his moral standards. They suppress it. They deliberately deny the truth. Then we see him say, what can be known about God is plain to them. This means what can be known about God is obvious and clear to understand. Then he goes on to say, God has shown it to them. It doesn't get any clearer than that. God has shown himself to them. He has given them all these things, and they're clear to these people. And then it says again, clearly perceived. This means it is taken in by the senses, heard, seen, felt, etc. Without a doubt. That's what this means, to be clearly perceived. There is no doubt of the evidence. And then it says finally, these people are without excuse. It means they lacking any justified defense. So there's no justifiable defense for denying what God has presented to him to prove his existence, to give them the evidence that they clamor for. That's what we see here. So when we see unbelievers claiming or complaining about there being no evidence for God or proof of his existence, what they don't understand is, one, God is satisfied with the evidence he has presented to them. So they can sit there and talk about there's no proof, no evidence, etc. God's like, well, there is. I've clearly shown you. And what does it say? It says they have suppressed the truth. They have denied what they have seen, what has clearly been shown to them, was clearly perceived by them. They are denying. So it's not that there's no evidence or no proof, or however you want to classify that. It's that they're just denying the evidence that's there. God is calling them a liar. You say there's no evidence, you're lying. I've given it to you. You just don't want to acknowledge it. This is why Jesus says they love the darkness rather than the light. They love their sin rather than the Lord. That's what this is all about. This isn't about show me some evidence. Show me some castle in the mountains, some throne on top of Mount Everest that shows God is there. They don't want to see that. They know the evidence is there. They're just denying it because they want to be their own gods. That's what this is about. This doesn't even mean that if they had proof of God, that they would turn to him anyway. This is what the conclusion is. And so when people say there's no evidence or proof of the existence of God, like I said, tell them God says you're lying. You don't want to acknowledge the evidence that does exist. The Bible even says later on, I think it's in one of the letters of Peter, that men are willfully ignorant. And this is talking about the evidence for the flood of Noah. Willfully ignorant. That means they know is the truth. They just deny it. They don't want to hear it. It's like, talk to the hand, Lord. I don't care. I want to do my thing, not your thing. I don't want to acknowledge you. So it's on them. It's not on God to prove his existence. It's on them to respond to the evidence that he's put out there. All of us who've come to faith in Jesus Christ, we've had some sort of evidence that we responded to, that God was real, and we turned to him by faith and accepted the gospel, accepted his offer of life and forgiveness and to be with him for eternity. We know we've experienced the evidence, and that's why it says to give a reason for the hope that we have when someone asks. It doesn't say to convince them of the reasons and of the hope we have, but this is why I believe what I believe, and we give it to them. And it's up to them to make a decision. But in the end, they have no excuse because God has clearly revealed himself to them and they have rejected him. That is the truth about this. It's not about the evidence. It's about their denial of the evidence. Have a good day.